Welcome. Thank you for joining us today for Harlan Clark's webinar, Customer Lifecycle Marketing Onboarding. I'm Stephanie Williams, Senior Strategist with Harlan Clark. For today's webinar, I am joined by Brad Strothkamp of Forrester Research and Matt Wilcox from Zions Bancorp. Let's take a look at our agenda for today. I will begin with a review of today's market conditions that are driving bankers to look at all ways to better engage and retain profitable customers, as well as review a few samples of customer onboarding contact streams. Then Brad Strothkamp from Forrester will share his insight on a strategic approach to onboarding. Matt Wilcox from Zions Bancorp will follow Brad in providing an overview of his organization's pathway to onboarding success. The three of us will wrap up our presentation with a roundtable discussion of onboarding practices and experiences. Throughout today's presentation, please engage in using the chat feature to submit your questions, which we'll attempt to address during the roundtable discussion. Bank earnings continue to be challenged on many fronts. One of the most significant challenges is the full-year impact of the Durbin Amendment. As illustrated in the yellow chart in this slide, depending on an institution's average transaction size, the impact can be very significant, especially in light of many institutions prioritizing the acquisition of mass affluent customers. This yellow chart from a recent Javelin study shows the significant revenue impact on larger transactions. Pre-Durbin, a $1,000 transaction provided about $15.02 of interchange revenue, whereas post-Durbin, that same transaction is worth just 72 cents. We see this confirmed as many banks are releasing their fourth quarter earnings reports. For example, SunTrust noted a $50 million impact or revenue reduction due to in the fourth quarter due to Durbin. Additionally, with interest margins narrowing and nearing that delicate 3% range, and deposits continuing to grow at a record pace, which was exhibited as checking and savings balances at U.S. banks topped $10 trillion in September of 2011. This continues to challenge earnings because banks are unable to effectively manage the interest margin on these deposits due to the depressed demand by both consumers and businesses for loans. Bank earnings also are challenged due to the lost benefit from improving credit portfolios that was seen during 2010 and 2011. Most banks benefited from a lower loan loss provision and used it to boost year-over-year earnings. As illustrated in the top left chart, you will see that loan demand remains flat. Loan-to-deposit ratios are lower than experienced in more than 10 years. That's shown by rates of 71 cents on the dollar for banks greater than $1 billion and 74.6 cents on the dollar for banks less than $1 billion. All of these challenges cause industry expert KBW to predict year-over-year earnings to decline for the fourth straight quarter. Their prediction seems accurate, as fourth quarter releases by Fifth Third, SunTrust, M&T, they're all posting earnings lower than in third quarter. During these difficult times, how can onboarding impact earnings? Well, let's take a look. Based on data from our Harlan Clark proprietary industry database seen here, and individual client program experience, we have seen attrition improvement as one of the most consistent impacts realized from the implementation of an onboarding program. For credit unions, their average first-year household attrition stands at approximately 13%. However, credit unions that are executing an onboarding program have seen their first-year household attrition rates average between 9 and 10%. Compare this to banks. Their average first-year household attrition stands quite a bit higher at approximately 21%. However, for banks executing an onboarding program, their average first-year household attrition rates average between 16 and 17%. These numbers may seem low compared to other industry quotables, and therefore it's important to note that these are at the household level, while many industry statistics are quoted at the account level. If you consider most households have an average of 2.2 accounts, you quickly see how to change that number. It would almost be double and more comparable with other industry quotes. So how does onboarding really fit into the overall marketing life cycle of a customer? At Harlan Clark, we view this as a continuum, not a single program or point in time. In order to enter other key phases of the customer life cycle, it's important to fully engage and activate a new relationship through onboarding, and it enables other phases such as utilization, cross-sell, and retention. It's important to note that this life cycle illustration is applicable beyond just consumers. It has also been successfully applied to small business relationships. Let's take a look at a real basic onboarding roadmap. As you can see from this roadmap, onboarding begins on the day of account opening, day 1, and lasts through day 90. This particular roadmap focuses its initial contact on activation and utilization while saving cross-sell for contacts at day 60 and beyond. Let's look at a more sophisticated onboarding roadmap. We have developed programs like this to leverage data available from the acquisition process to hone messaging in on topics more relevant to the audience based on their characteristics. In this diagram, expected value for prospects and current customer expansion are the key drivers of the contact streams. Now that we've shared a view of market conditions that clamor for more engaged and retained customer relationships and a general definition of onboarding, Brad Strothkamp from Forrester Research will share his thoughts on a strategic approach to onboarding success. Brad?
Thank you, Stephanie. I appreciate it. That's very interesting data. Always good to get the information, to actually see the data to show the impact that onboarding can have. I want to take a little bit of time to talk about onboarding from a strategic perspective, because there's a lot of activities going on out there, and Matt Wilcox in a minute will come back and talk a little bit about what Zions is doing, which is interesting. But how do you approach these programs? So Forrester undertook some research to interview firms that were conducting onboarding activities to understand a little bit about what their approach was, maybe some of the obstacles, especially relevant for those of you who are thinking about doing onboarding and haven't approached it yet, or who have more grassroots onboarding that maybe want to centralize it and make it a common function. A couple things I'd like to discuss, a little bit about the goals of onboarding, a little bit redundant from what Stephanie just said, but sort of to give you my perspective on that information. Obstacles, this came specifically out of our research, so what kind of obstacles did we see in the onboarding process? And then best practices from a strategic perspective. So how do you approach developing an onboarding strategy and executing on that strategy? From an onboarding perspective, I'm going to start at a very high level and give you some of our data that we get on a yearly basis. So just to kind of set the stage, in any given year, and for 2011, about 36% of consumers opened a financial account. So to give you a sense that just over about a third of U.S. consumers open a financial product in any given year. What products do they open? Typically the ones you'd probably expect: credit cards, auto insurance, checking and savings accounts, to a lesser degree auto loans, and things like insurance and investments. So a lot of what we're going to talk about here does center around credit cards and checking, and rightly so, because those are the products that are most likely to be opened up from year to year. The problem is, alluding to what Stephanie talked about, we lose a lot of those consumers. In fact, on average, Stephanie had said for banks, about 21%. Dove Consulting laid it out to be as much as 25 to 30% of those first-year customers are lost. Why are they lost? So, well, first of all, let's understand the effects of onboarding. Onboarding activities are specifically meant to reduce that attrition. How does it reduce attrition? Well, it does it in one of two ways. It improves activation. So if they get customers who buy a product to begin using that product at its very simple basis, well, they're less likely to leave. So from a deposit perspective, and activation means different things to different products, it might include depositing money in the account. From a credit card perspective, it might be activating the card and actually making a purchase. For things like investment accounts, it might be making a trade. For investment accounts that have advisory associated with it, it might be working with an advisor. But the other impact is not just activation, so not just using it, but using it frequently. So I don't just set up direct deposit, but I actually start making bill payments, or I actually start writing checks. For credit cards, I make multiple purchases through that card. For investment accounts, I make multiple trades, or I access my advisor multiple times. So onboarding is specifically geared towards impacting these elements of attrition. Well, what does it mean, and why is onboarding so important? And we always hear about the time frames. This data is actually from Harlan Clark that shows that most of the attrition occurs within the first 3 months. And that's why timeliness of the information is so vitally important. Because if you miss that window, that first 90 days, the majority of the consumers are probably already gone. So that attrition that's 25 to 30%, a third, maybe a half of that has already happened. You've already missed the window. Why do consumers leave? Well, BEI did some research here that I think is very insightful and actually jives well with what I heard in my interviews. First of all, being sold the wrong product. And you might say, well, how does that happen? How do we sell the wrong product? Well, a lot of it has to do with compensation measures, how the branch bankers or how folks are compensated or goaled could drive the wrong product sales. So, for example, if we have high compensation around higher-end products, we might have people who tend towards selling those products even if it doesn't necessarily meet what the customer needs. Well, in the end of the day, the sale may be made, but the sale is lost because the consumer is lost in the end. Fail to execute on fulfillment. So all the different activities that have to happen after an account is opened up, plastic received, checks received, any kind of funding that needs to happen, and materials that need to go back and forth. If that doesn't happen, the account doesn't get activated, the consumer's probably lost. Either they go back to their older provider or they go to another provider. After purchase surprises. So, and this gets back to a concept that Forrester talks a lot about, which is customer advocacy. Transparency. Do we let consumers know about everything that might happen? Fees that are involved with the account. If we don't disclose those up front and the user finds out about them after they've acquired the product, they very well might leave. That leads to attrition. So we need to think about not only our goals, but how we sell those products. That can impact as much around attrition as anything else. But in addition to attrition, and Stephanie alluded to this later on in the onboarding activity, we want to cross-sell. And consumers on average have less than a third of their financial products with a single provider. To give you an idea around that and why it's so important, onboarding can play a role there also. Onboarding can help drive cross-selling. Well, why is cross-selling so important related to onboarding? Well, first of all, let's understand product ownership. So every year we track the number of products consumers have and who they have them with. And we know that the average consumer has about 6.8 products per household, per adult. If they're online bankers, they have 7.6 products. If they're online bill payers, they have 8.5 products. Here's the problem. Of that 6.8 products, on average, any given firm has 2.1 of that. So just about 30%. The best firms, which are USA and credit unions, have a little bit over half at best, and USAA. So the opportunity is huge. Well, then you might ask yourself, what impact does cross-selling have from a profitability and retention perspective? Well, Wells Fargo has done years of study around this, and this is where I came from. I came from Wells Fargo prior to coming to Forrester. This is actually from one of their investor conferences where they laid out the consumer has less than one product, 2 to 3, 5 to 6 products, 10 to 20 products. Now, no matter what you think about how Wells Fargo counts products, the data is still relevant because we see that consumers who have less than one product, on average, stay about their tenure is about 3.8 months or 3.8 years. If that consumer has 10 to 20 products, they're far more likely to stay. So cross-selling is extremely important, as in onboarding is initially, to retention. So it's amazing how all these concepts kind of play together. But cross-selling is also important, and why onboarding is so important related to it is that a lot of the cross-selling happens early on. In fact, we see that 60% of the cross-selling that is done typically happens within the first month. So at the same time these consumers are potentially leaving if they're not activating or sold the wrong product, if we're not cross-selling them early on, we may lose the best opportunity that we have to cross-sell these customers. So onboarding is not only important from an activation perspective, it's also as important from a cross-sell perspective. One thing I hear a lot about these days in talking to executives is a desire to improve the customer experience. I hear this at the channel level. I hear it at the product level. Onboarding is a part of that. If you think about onboarding and really at its essence what it's about, it's essentially our out-of-box experience. So we all know Apple is an organization that spends numerous hours figuring out when you open up that iPod or that iPhone, what's that experience? What's the box look like? How does it feel? How easy is it to set up? Onboarding is one of our key aspects for improving the customer experience for financial services. It is the customer's first introduction to us as a provider. Why is that important? J.D. Power and Associates has been able to figure out that more attention and more touches during the initial stages of a product open increases customer satisfaction. So if they open an account, if we do things like needs assessment, providing follow-up in a timely manner, following up by the same individual they talked to in a branch, additional follows up by phone, they've been actually able to determine that the percentage of customer satisfaction increases. So if we're thinking about ways as an organization that we can improve our customer satisfaction, our customer experience, onboarding is a piece of that. It's a big piece of that. What does a quality experience mean? Well, to me, in essence, there's a couple different ways to look at it. A quality customer experience means reducing the reasons why people leave. So here's some data from a survey we just did in the fourth quarter last year where we asked consumers, what's the most important reason why you closed your account? Some things we can't do a whole lot about. Moving, getting married, life events. Well, we really can't tell people they can't get married or can't move. What we can understand is the degree that things like fees, mergers, maybe bank closures or movements of ATMs or unjustified fees cause people to leave. If we think about onboarding, and this might affect individuals, we want to make sure that we speak to that to the degree that we can. On the flip side, we want to reinforce to new customers why our existing customers stay with us. So we ask consumers in our survey around what are the two most important reasons that they stayed so long with their primary checking account bank? Location. about customer service, the fees themselves. We saw that earlier. Loyalty. Too much trouble to switch. That's probably not something you're going to spend a whole lot of time on, but you might reinforce to them as a part of your onboarding campaign, how, things around where the branches are and how we've been, for the last 5 years, our customer service rating. You might include ratings and reviews from existing customers. If there's any kind of cognitive dissonance about that purchase, reinforce why our customers stay with us, because there's very likely that those reasons will resonate with those new customers. So this makes so much sense around what Stephanie laid out, what I've talked about here. What doesn't happen? Well, in my interviews, a couple things kind of came up. I don't want to spend a whole lot of time here, but I just want to kind of brush on a couple of these. One is lack of consistent programs. Of the onboarding campaigns that typically exist, they're very much grassroots. They're either done at the product group level. They may even be done by a third party who provides that product. We see a lot in credit cards where maybe a credit card is a co-branded card and that co-branded partner does the onboarding. It may be a situation that it's done by a function level, by marketing. It may be a situation that it's being done by the channel. Very seldom do we see sort of an enterprise group handling this. It's sort of grassroots. And there's a lot of lack of consistency, which results in inefficient programs and processes. Data availability come up a lot of times. We know that timeliness is important, but we can't get the data. So that hinders getting information out there. If we know based on J.D. Power and Associates that contact within 3 days increases satisfaction, and we can't get there for a week, what does that mean to us? Customer and channel blindness. We don't spend as much time. We fail to understand, why do consumers leave? Why do they leave us? If we lose 25% of those new customers in the first 6 months, why is that occurring? Now, onboarding programs are great, but you may find out that it's a fault of, as I said earlier, misaligned goals, and we have to think about that. And finally, misaligned goals themselves. So from an onboarding perspective, the goals of onboarding are really around activation and cross-sell. But if all your goals, for example, at the branch level or at the channel level or at marketing are around acquisition and new customer acquisition, that may run counter to people even thinking about onboarding. So we have to think through those goals, and we'll talk about that in a second. So what are some best practices here in terms of onboarding strategy? Well, first of all, it's important to understand that onboarding is a cross-functional, cross-channel activity. Centralized strategy and management has to be there. There has to be a group of individuals that are doing things like developing the business case for funding, making recommendations for enterprise onboarding goals, so developing those goals, finding out around resources, setting up metrics. There's got to be a group, and it could be a single individual, it could be a group of individuals whose partial goal is onboarding, that are working together to develop a centralized strategy. There has to be some level of enterprise funding. On its own, onboarding, as Stephanie showed, we can build a business case. That business case, especially to the degree that major changes need to be done, like say, for example, there needs to be a major change to a core business system in order to get the data that is needed to conduct onboarding. That may be darn near impossible for a single entity like a line of business. But if a group of businesses come together and say, as a centralized group, yes, this costs a lot, but all 6 of these business groups will benefit, and here's what the benefit will be through enterprise funding, that might be more likely. This centralized group has to spend a lot of time benchmarking the status quo, because metrics are key to not only initial success, but ongoing funding and success. So working with customer intelligence teams to understand things like cross-sell rates of existing customers, customer tenure, customer profitability. We have to understand where do we need to get new customers to get them to stay, to get them to be more profitable. That comes from benchmarking. Here's a simple business case that drawn from some information that Harlan Clark actually put together. Let's understand the universe. So let's say, for example, 40,000 branch-based deposit accounts in a 12-month period. Assuming a 25% attrition, that's about 10,000 accounts could attrite within a 12-month period. What does that mean cost-wise? Well, you got to remember a couple different factors. There's the cost of acquiring the account, the operational cost of opening the account up, the lost revenue from losing the customer, so revenue that you might accrue, cross-selling that might happen. Let's conservatively assume that that cost is around $200. We can develop an ROI off of that. So assuming an onboarding campaign costs $7 per new account, the cost for 40,000 customers would be around $280,000. So you can achieve a positive ROI by reducing attrition by just 3% over the first 12 months. Stephanie has already shown through some of their own data that that can be achieved, and that's just break even. So anything above that is gravy. So the opportunity is clearly here, and an ROI, unlike some things in financial services, an ROI in onboarding can be done and can be done very well. The last piece I want to talk about is strategizing across channels and touch points. This is one thing that we need to think about. Most of the onboarding campaigns, they focus in on the branch, they focus in on the phone. The reason why you need to focus larger than that is you need to think about things like direct mail as an opportunity, but you also need to think about how consumers use the bank. Ongoing, especially for younger consumers that are most likely opening up these new accounts, we may never see them in a branch after the account is opened up. They may not be as willing to accept that phone call. Where are we going to see them? We're going to see them through the alternative channels, digital, online, ATM. What I'm showing here is the frequency of use among consumers among channels that they actually use. We can see that on average, consumers access online 43 times over a given year, 29 times for the ATM. This is versus 19 times in person. So the digital channels, as well as direct mail, have to play a role here. We need to think about a very robust onboarding campaign that considers all channels and that really understands how people use channels. So how should I approach defining and setting up an onboarding strategy? I want to talk a little bit about that. Our perspective is you need to think about 4 things: people, objectives, strategies, and technologies. I'm going to walk through each of these really quickly. People and processes. This is most likely missed within an organization. You have got to investigate product open and service activation obstacles. People who attrite during the first 12 months, why? Is it related to the product? Is it related to our service? Is it related to something else? You cannot attack a problem. You cannot develop a strategy until you first understand what you're trying to solve. What's the problem? It may end up that part of the response is as much a change to the product as it is doing onboarding. Where do people touch? How do they use the bank? If I'm going to figure out the most effective approach to onboarding, I have to think about how the customer, that new customer, over the first 12 months interacts with the bank. Where are the first touches? Are they most likely to call over the phone? Would they walk into a branch again? Or would I see them through a digital channel? Are they open to things like direct mail, or as part of account opening packages? We need to think about that. We need to understand the potential data quality issues. Are we going to have a problem with data? We need to know that up front. It is only then that we can begin to set objectives. So we begin to benchmark customers who attrite versus those who do not. Well, why do we do that? Because that is our objective. The gap between those two groups, the gap between those who are our good customers, a year or so with us, and those who attrite in terms of how long they stay, why they leave, the products that they own with us, and their profitability becomes part of their ROI case. From an objective perspective, we have to think across channels. We can't just think about a product or a channel. We have to think about building onboarding goals and objectives that consider all channels and all functions and the team in general. So objectives have to be far-flung. Next, we'll talk about strategy. We need to consider all touch points and channels in the strategy. We can't just think about what we're going to do with the outbound sales queue. We can't think about what's just going to happen in the branch, because once a consumer leaves that branch or hangs up the phone, they still need onboarding. We need to think about all the channels, including things like alternative channels like ATMs and the digital channels. Provide a visual timeline. Stephanie just gave you a great example of how to do that. Lay that out. Lay out the activities, the timeline, when things are going to happen and what channels are going to happen. That will help you not only sell the opportunity, but it also help you figure out where the holes may be. Set organizational standards across key processes. So we need to think about, for each function, product, and group, what role in the strategy they're going to play, and let's set standards around it, timelines when things need to be received. We need, and this a lot is going to be done by this enterprise group, to set out those standards by which we're going to live by. It is only then that we begin to think about technology. So we start outlining the systems to deliver. So once we know what the results are to be, then we figure out the technologies to deliver those results. Once we figure out what the channels we want to use, then we figure out the technologies related to channels that currently exist or we need to get. We outline existing technologies first. Let's not go out and buy something that we may have internally. This will take some time. Figure out what different channels may have available. We also need to think about engaging external vendors. One thing I've learned along the way, and especially working with organizations such as Harlan Clark, is there's a tremendous amount of data. There's a tremendous amount of experience there. We're going to see what Zions Bank has done in a second. There are a lot of best practices to leverage off of, not only including execution, but things like data. So we want to make sure, as a part of our strategy from a technology perspective, we consider that everything may not have to come internally. There might be some external opportunities. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Matt, who's going to take you through the Zion Bank story to bring it down to level and talk about how an organization actually did this for themselves.
Thanks so much, Brad. I appreciate it. Hindsight 2020, wish we could go back in time and have Brad's presentation as we began to kick off our onboarding strategy. But we were fortunate, as Brad alluded to on his 4 objectives. Number 4 was really aligning yourselves with a key vendor, and we were very fortunate to utilize Harlan Clark and their marketing services arm to really get started with that. Our onboarding program really fell out of necessity, more or less. We didn't approach it initially with strategic mindset. We weren't really looking at it from reducing attrition or anything like that. Believe it or not, we started, at least the beginning of our onboarding strategy, out of necessity for our online accounts. And we have a fairly large direct bank that we open accounts across the United States. And the first piece of our onboarding strategy kind of fell into our laps when we realized we needed to have information sent out to the customer base via direct mail. And that included signature cards at the time, checks that would come, various other account-related information. And it really kind of dawned on us after we started sending out those communications that we really don't have any sort of customer touch point with our clients after they come into the branch after opening an account. And so here we are already treating customers that we don't even have a visual representation of seeing face-to-face, and we're already treating them differently than more or less our other customers that come into our branches on a daily basis. So with that knowledge in mind, we then reached out and started working with Harlan Clark on a clear-cut strategy for onboarding. And I would love to tell the people on the call that the original adaptation of our onboarding program is exactly how it went and how it was planned, but it certainly did not end up the way we started. And to no fault of anybody's, we really learned throughout the process that there are some key strategic things that we needed to really focus on. And the first thing that we embarked on, and really that we realized early on in the process, in order for this to be successful, is we had to identify somebody to really own the onboarding process and all of the strategy around it. And really the sound rationale around having to have somebody really own the onboarding program in your organization is vital, because lots of different groups play a key role in the onboarding program, but you need somebody to really facilitate that, not necessarily from a project management standpoint, but from a program ownership standpoint, so that they can hold all of the relevant parties accountable. The other thing that we really started out with, that I think if we could go back and do over again, is really not focus on multiple designs and multiple test groups. Really keep it very, very easy and simple as you're getting started. And one of the key examples that I'll say there is, Zions Bank, the brick and mortar presence is in Utah and Idaho. And we spent a great deal of time talking about design and other sort of implications between communicating with our customers in Utah versus Idaho, and what that should look like. And really, that was time well spent after I think the program is launched. But keep it very, very simple as you're getting started with your onboarding program, because it's very key as you're putting together a program such as this to really get it started, show the fruits of your labor, show some of the success before you start to make too many modifications and refinements. We really have taken the onboarding program from where it was in the infancy stages of really a direct mail piece. We added an email component, and there was a phone component, and that was really the basics of our onboarding program early on. How it's really evolved over the last several years is it's really become the centerpiece to our customer lifecycle marketing program. Onboarding, as you saw in both Stephanie's presentation as well as Brad's, there can be very, very sophisticated communication matrix and timing that is utilized from when day one you communicate all the way to 360 days later within that first year of the customer lifecycle. We've used that strategy and really adopted that to the majority of our marketing approach. So not only with the retention efforts that are going and we're embarking on with onboarding, as well as the balanced lift and increased products per household, but we've used that really for a full-fledged acquisition strategy as well. So the model that you put into place for your onboarding program is key, because it'll dovetail nicely into future marketing endeavors that you take part in. One of the key focal points for us as we started this was making sure that we were focusing on enhancing the relationship with the customer, not selling them products. And that was a very, very tough sell for a lot of our executives, as well as others in our marketing area, because they're very, very focused and centered on increasing products per household, product sales, and deriving revenue from all marketing efforts. And I'm not saying that we didn't approach this without the direct intuition to derive revenue, but we really had to take a step back and make sure that objective number one for us was enhancing the customer relationship. These customers were looking to us to be their trusted financial advisor. They were trusting us with their finances. Outside of friends and family, finances is really up there in the top 4 or 5 things that are important to people. And we wanted to make sure that the message that we communicated early and often was that we wanted to thank them and appreciated their business and focused on products and services that enhance the relationship that we really call engagement services, such as online banking, such as getting them signed up for our email newsletter, things that really helped them manage their relationship. It wasn't focused on getting them to sign up for another checking account or another savings account. Now, that came later on in the process as we had gained that trust from them, but really the first focus is really to make sure that we spend time enhancing that customer relationship. And it really didn't go without its sort of struggles, and what helped in getting that thing bought on and people invested into it was really trying to finding an executive that really spearheaded our efforts. And so we aligned ourselves with an advocate within the organization who carried it forward for us, who was in the meetings, and it was really helping showcases. So as we started small and we selected the test segment, we started with just 10% of our customer base, and that's evolved now where we've got everybody involved, all of our customers in the onboarding program with a very, very small control to still ensure that we're doing the right thing. But overall, it's evolved to a full-fledged program for us. And then on the next slide, if we could go forward, sharing some of the results, it's been very, very successful for us. And we've opened this now up for the other banks in our network. So Zions Bancorp has 8 banks in 10 states. Zions Bank is the first one we've started this program for, and we're working with Harland on doing this for our other banks as well. But you can see off of the metrics here that overall the retention lift was 2.5% of the goal. The account retention lift was 6.7% over the control group, and this has remained steady from start to finish. I mean, we have not seen numbers really dwindle, and so we know now that the onboarding is a key and vital component to all of the communications we have going forward. And then if you look at the balance retention lift, I mean, balances are growing with these customers, so even without that hard sales push and really focusing on the engagement services early on, we're still getting more of the pie from that customer. And if you look at the incremental balance, it's up over 46% from the control. So it's been a quite successful endeavor, a quite lengthy endeavor, and one that continues to evolve. So our onboarding program is never remained static or stagnant. It's continuing to evolve. We continue to have meetings on a daily basis, and we continue to have one owner who oversees that to make the modifications. And we seek feedback from others within the organization that talk to the customers, whether it's the call center or branch employees, that we have an ongoing focus group focused on getting feedback on how the program is going outside of the results that you see on the slide there. So that's more or less the history around the Zions Bank program, but one that has been very, very successful. And as I said earlier, the onboarding program has really become a key to our customer lifecycle marketing program and management of the customer communication chain.
Thanks, Matt. Now I think what we're going to move forward on is going to the onboarding roundtable. In terms of the onboarding roundtable, we have 3 panelists. Brad Strathkamp, Vice President and Principal Analyst from Forrester. Matt Wilcox, who just was kind enough to share the story from Zions. He's the Director of Interactive Services for Zions Bancorp. And then myself, Stephanie Williams. I'm a market strategist for Harlan Clark. What the 3 of us are going to talk about are some of the important issues or kind of some of the nitty-gritty around onboarding and deploying a program. But this would be a great time if you have questions and follow-up to some of the information you've heard to go ahead and submit. To start out with, Brad, I would like to ask you, what types of shared onboarding goals would help more banks? You said that you talked to a number of banks and you saw some recurring themes. What did you find out on that front?
What generally we've seen is that in this, to a degree, this gets into the silo nature of most financial services organizations. Everybody has their own goals. But some goals should be consistent across all channels, all products, all functions, those being things around not just acquisition, but retention, cross-sell, activation, and utilization. And what the onboarding team needs to be able to do is, and really I thought Matt's information was great, which is saying what are our goals? Let's clearly define those goals around onboarding. And let's make sure that we understand the impact that each channel or function or the product group can have on those goals. And then that aspect of the goal has to be a part of that individual team or channel's goals. So if we know, for example, that reducing new customer attrition is a goal, and we know that right now new customer attrition rate is 25%, and we have a goal that we we believe we can meet, which is reducing new customer attrition by 3%. That I would make sure, for example, if I was thinking about the digital channels, that a part of the digital channel executives' goals are reducing new customer attrition and as a part of their goals. Now, you may have to define to what degree that they can help, but that should be a part of the goals. That's typically not what happens. So they would probably have. Go ahead, Stephanie.
And I wonder, Matt, with your experience and what you've walked through in terms of onboarding, have you seen a shift organizationally to more shared goals, like what Brad's talking about?
We have, absolutely, and it didn't happen immediately, and it happened over time, and as we started to see kind of the importance that this played, but we've seen an overall shift in shared goal and shared responsibility, given that the necessary evil that we're in as far as where the industry has gone. There's an overarching responsibility for everybody, and that's come with shared goals, as Brad's been putting it.
Great. And an extension of that, what are the strong first steps? I mean, you shared with us a little bit during your presentation about identifying an owner. In your case, what are some of the qualities that you looked for in that owner to help you walk through the process?
Yeah, that's a great question, and we had a couple of candidates that we looked at internally that were already in our marketing group, and we eventually landed on somebody that was already internal, that was very familiar with the organization, familiar with the customer base, and we found somebody that very, very strong on the data side. And the reason we went down the route where we wanted somebody strong on the data side is that the data is really key in this program, because you're analyzing the data on an ongoing basis, and you're utilizing that data to make modifications to the program. So we knew we needed somebody that could really help from a visual representation to look at the branding components and make sure that it looked pretty, so to speak, but that really would focus on the analytics side of this, that would really analyze the program, the benefits of it, and not afraid to share good news versus bad news, because we certainly had our share of struggles early on as we started to evolve the program, get multiple parties involved to get this thing going and kicked off. So we really wanted to make sure we had somebody strong on the data side, familiar with the organization already, and somebody that was comfortable in presenting both good news and bad news.